IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Today we have Sarthak Pradhan, my friend and colleague, and we're talking about this very interesting update that RBI has come out about a change in the ownership of how banks are run in the country. So I'll let Sarthak give us a quick background of what the move is, and then we'll dive in.
Hi, Saurabh. Thanks for having me here. So before we start, I just want to give you a brief background here. So as we're recording this episode, there is an ongoing intense debate. And this debate is related to the report that the internal working group of RBI presented in the month of November. So this internal working group was constituted in June 2020, and the mandate that was given to them that they have to review the ownership guidelines, corporate structure for private banks in India. And they came up with a report in the month of November, and they have come up with a host of recommendations. But one of the key recommendation is that we should be permitting big corporate and industrial outfits to own banks. In fact, they have also given proposals like NBFCs, the non-banking financial companies having at least 10 years record, who have an asset size more than 50,000 crores. They should also be converted into, they should be given the option to convert into banks. So these provisions have been there. And this has led to some sort of debate in the sense that given the history that we have had in the past, what has happened. So those kind of things have raised questions. So that's the reason we are discussing this. So Saurabh, what we are doing here is we are trying to promote more private players to participate in banking activities. Okay. Now, do you visualize anything different? Do you see anything different between banking sector and other businesses?
So I think off the bat, definitely there's a difference between how a bank is run, the factors involved in regulating a bank, and its very sensitive nature to the economy and any other business. But then the answer is somewhere in between. At some point of time, there are also profit is an important word in banking. Right? We know that in India, we have a lot of public sector banks which have failed to turn profits over the years. And the cost of them not making a profit is basically all taxpayers bail them out every year. Right? So some may say that banks are not supposed to make profits, that's not their job. But overall, I think banks are a different form of business, but the word business cannot be dropped from banking.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the role of banking sector, right, it plays a significantly important role in the economy. What do banks do? If I have to simplify it, basically they are those conduits which are converting small scattered savings of individuals into investments. People like you, we all go and deposit money in our banks. We save money in our banks, and this money is now invested. This money is given as loans to corporates, and who will now be investing in different enterprises, which helps the economy grow, which helps in the economic development. And apart from that, they're also monitoring these investments. They're ensuring they're exerting pressure so that corporate governance is followed by different entities. And in this entire thing, they're reducing the transaction costs massively. If I have to invest directly in some firm, it might be very difficult for me. There's information costs, there is search costs, bargaining costs, all these things are reduced. And also on top of it, there is information asymmetry. So banks are trying to reduce all these things. They're trying to reduce the transaction costs. They're trying to bridge this information asymmetry, and they're helping the economy grow. So banks are extremely relevant for the economy. But thing is, if you look at the status of the banking sector in India, it's not what we expect, or it's not something optimal. If you look at the top 100 global banks, hardly there will be one bank from India which features in that. If you look at banking in terms of, or if you look at the performance of banking in terms of credit as a percentage of GDP, India lags behind in that scenario as well. I would expect banks to be there in each and every village, in cities, obviously they are there. But again, this has not happened as expected. If you look at the data from 2011 census, hardly some 58% of the total population of India is availing different kind of banking services, and some 6 lakh villages are there in India, but hardly 25,000 villages have a bank branch. So over a period of time, we have observed that people are not under the formal financial channel, and whatever credit requirement is there, if an economy has to grow, they need finances, but the credit demand that is there, it is not being, at least our banking sector is not able to meet that credit demand. So we would want the banking sector to do that. I think this is probably the reason why they would have come up with this recommendation.
Thank you for the fantastic refresher on why banks are important. And I think a very important word is capital. The economy can grow only to the extent of capital available with it. And another tragedy in India is that our capital markets are highly dependent on banking. So if a startup has to raise money through, say, bonds, by offering bonds, or say by doing an IPO, that is something which has huge transaction costs, and it's not very easily readable. And our capital markets are much smaller than what developed countries have to offer. So apart from the need for capital, banks themselves become the only place where a medium or small enterprise or even a big corporate can turn to for loans. And I want to meander into the second problem that we are facing in our country, which is sometimes considered a systemic risk, is NPAs, right? No banking discussion is complete without talking about NPAs. And I think this is where a lot of skepticism for corporate houses getting into banking comes in, because they've been some or the other way related to a massive number of frauds when it comes to lending, right? So public sector banks or other banks give away loans and to corporates which are not able to pay the loan back. And maybe the amount of money given to them was not the ideal amount, or maybe there are different quid pro quos attached. And in the information asymmetry, we see that a lot of corporate houses aren't able to pay that money back. And that has a huge cost to the economy. And most importantly, it has a huge cost to the public. Right? The small people who save money, and the banks channeling that money to the corporate houses. When the corporate houses default, it is the small person's money on the line. So how do you see this move having an effect on NPAs? How do you see, how is with the systemic risk? Is there a change from the systemic risk point of view of corporate houses getting a step ahead, and instead of just being lenders, also becoming the owners of banks?
Yeah, exactly. I think it has also got to do with history to some extent. If you look at India after independence, like 1950s, at that point of time also there was a scenario where the corporates were owning the banks, and there used to be these intra-group transactions, and this was considered to be one of the reasons which led to the nationalization of banks in 1969. And at present, again, similar kind of fears are there that if you have more corporates in the banking sector, or they are allowed to have licenses, then there will be conflict of interest. There will be different kind of moral hazards. The group which is owning the bank, it might so happen that the bank gives loans to them. So there is this apprehension there. Apart from that, some people have raised apprehensions about circular banking. That can also happen. So one bank which is owned by a particular corporate gives loan to another corporate, which again owns another bank. This bank gives loan to another corporate. So that kind of cyclical, circular banking can be there. So it can lead to different kind of systemic risks. And given the fact that in case of India, corporate governance practices are not at par with many of the developed economies. It is not something which, many of these firms, many firms in India do not have these apt practices. So these risks are always there. And not only this, tracking all these things is also difficult. It might so happen that there is a corporate owned bank which is lending to another company, but this company it might be very difficult to identify that this company actually is an offshoot of the company which owns the bank. There can be shell companies, there can be front companies, so it might be very difficult to identify the owner. And there are questions whether the regulator that we have has the capacity to find out, identify these kind of issues. So I think these are some of the major reasons why there are these apprehensions right now.
Right. Makes me wonder. One way to think about this is that people are free to do what they have to, and the rule of law takes care that nobody breaches the understanding of how things work in the society and how the government is regulating this. And I think the committee, to some extent, was mindful of such a conflict arising.
Yeah.
So whatever its recommendation came, it came with a caveat, right? And which is placed right in the brackets, which I quote says, to prevent connected lending and exposures between the banks and other financial and non-financial group entities, and strengthening of supervisory mechanism for large conglomerates, including consolidated supervision. So my question then to you is, should we now shy off? So, if you see, there's a scale, right?
Yeah.
There are trade-offs involved where you could have an inflow of massive capital, which we are in a desperate need of, given the pandemic, given how small our economy is and how our ambitions are. And on the other side, we have people who may exploit the system, and there may be negative costs attached. Is it something for the government to consider? And do you trust the government can build that mechanism, or RBI? Because if is there any regulator in the economy that we trust most in India, it's probably RBI. Right? Maybe it does half of its job good enough. So do you think with this caveat attached, it's possible to make this happen and we can have the cake and eat it too?
Yeah, so it is interesting to see that there are different kind of riders when in the internal working group committee's recommendations. So they have mentioned that we have to have mechanisms to prevent connected lending. And again, there are a host of other things as well. But one thing that needs to be kept in mind is, do we have the capacity? Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar, in their book In Service to the Republic, they talk about the different sectors, regulations in different sectors. They talk about what kind of regulation is easy, what kind of regulation is hard. Whenever the number of transactions are very high, whenever there is a lot of discretion at the hands of the civil servant, whenever the stakes are high, whenever there is secrecy, these are the scenarios where it is not easy to regulate. Just look at the banking sector. The transactions, the number of transactions is quite high. The stakes involved are very high. If I get a loan, I will start my own enterprise. If I don't get a loan, I'll be just there. So financial regulation is something which needs massive capacity. So we need to think about it, whether RBI has the capacity to deal with it. Because financial regulation, apart from tax administration, criminal justice system, judiciary, these are the things which require maximum capacity, and this is one of those things. So you have rightly pointed out that there are riders, but do we have the present capacity? If we have the capacity, then we should go ahead, or else we should build the capacity. So the question is whether we have the state capacity for financial regulation, for finding out whether connected lending is happening, circular banking is happening. And if you look at banking sector, just look at the number of transactions that happen, look at the discretion that bankers have, and look at the stakes. I mean, if I am getting a loan, I might start my enterprise, but if I don't get it, I will be just over there. So financial regulation, apart from tax administration, judiciary, criminal justice system, these are the things which require massive state capacity. So we need to ask these questions whether the regulator, the financial regulator, the Reserve Bank of India has this capacity to detect all the different kind of intra-group transactions or other kind of conflict of interest that we have. And on top of that, do we have the corporate governance structures, right? It is also equally important, because if you look at history, we have had public sector banks, but 1991 onwards, private entities were also given licenses to start banks. And at that point of time, you had two corporate owned banks. One of them is doing well, the IndusInd Bank, but then other one did not work out well. I think Times Bank. So if in the past also we have some firm, some corporate which got the license, which is operating a bank, which is doing well, maybe we also have to look at the difference in corporate structures, right? Corporate governance structures. Why this particular institution did well and the other one did not do well. And one thing, Dr. Amol Agarwal, he has written an article in the Hindustan Times, and he analyzes the different, the 14 private banks that came up 90s onwards, right? After 1990s, 14 live banks were given licenses. And he observes that out of these 14, 6 have been in that troubled, merged category. And out of the 6, 4 were actually run by professionals, right? So even if they're being run by professionals, if they're failing, and there is one bank which was owned by the corporate and it is doing well, maybe we also have to look at the other things, the corporate governance and all these mechanisms. If they are fine, maybe things will work.
I think there is a larger picture also to look at. So if you're looking at raising capital, and our way to increase the capital in the economy is to allow corporate houses alone, maybe there are more options and possible reforms. And I think Raghuram Rajan with Viral Acharya put together a paper covering the ideas of what we can do. And all recommendations come to 2 committees, right? This is a name we keep hearing again and again.
Yeah.
The Narasimhan Committee and the PJ Nayak Committee. I mean, if you, I remember very vividly in 2014, our first banking lesson started by just reading these committee reports. And ever since, the conversation has always been around these 2 committees. So maybe those reforms are extremely timely, and maybe we don't need to take this drastic step, right? And I think just to sum up, I'll quickly tell you, like from the top of my mind, what the 2 major recommendations were of this committee. And I want to know your take on what you think. If we are taking more risk, which is needless, or this is something which we can overcome anyway, which is the more fundamental levels of reform. So the first is, I think, the on-tap licensing regime, right? That anyone who can get in to licensing should be given a license on a free basis, right? To decrease the entry barriers. So like you said, right, there are people who are good at this, and there are people who are not so good at this. And our problem is we get stuck with one set of people. So if there is one particular conglomerate or one particular institution not doing bad, it's very difficult for them to get out of the economy, right? We don't have great resolution processes for banking. IBC is in its very nascent stage, and we're not happy about banks going to the IBC route of things. And at the same time, there are great organizations which may prove to use technology, come up with cutting-edge fintech solutions, who do not really make it where they can. Their potential is not fully exploited in the economy. So maybe that is something we need to think about. And the second most important thing, which I really want to your take especially on, is how we think about government and banking, right? So how public sector, I mean, the problem that we're talking about corporate houses lending to themselves is actually true for the government. And in some parts, I think it's a bit hypocritical for the government to say that, you may not, but we can. Because at the end of the day, government as an institution also owns banks. And at times, government bends the banks towards their particular needs. There are vested interests where the government lends or directs banks what to do, instead of the banks having that kind of autonomy. So, what do you think about this?
Yeah, the first point that you raised is interesting, that there are so many firms which are doing well. They do well. They have very good business practices. They have the best of talent. They are managing their own businesses really well. So if they are doing these things well, why not use this talent or whatever they have in banking? I'm totally in for it, right? It is something that we need to do. So apart from getting capital, okay, these if there is private ownership or if there are corporate houses which are starting banks, then we will get capital, and apart from that we'll also get this managerial talent and all these things. So this is something definitely which is positive. Only thing that I have apprehension is whether we have the capacity to monitor it, or whether the regulator is good enough for it, right? And whether we have the corporate governance mechanisms which can prevent different kind of frauds and all these things. And in recent times, if you look at the different bank failures that we have had, or different issues with the banks that we have had, right from the recent one, Lakshmi Vilas Bank, PMC Bank, Yes Bank, so many things we have. So that is the reason I might be slightly apprehensive. But definitely, we would want more banks. We would want, if there are more banks, right? If the entry barriers are, it is easy to acquire a banking license, but at the same time, you are ensuring that there is no fraud and all these things. So you'll have more banks, you will have greater competition between these banks, there will be more efficiency, new kind of services they might offer, different kind of products they will come up with. And as a result of which, the number of people who are covered under the formal financial channels will increase. So that definitely this is a positive thing. Just that we probably also have to think about our capacity right now, whatever capacity that we have, whether it is sufficient or whether we need to do something about it.
Right. So I think this has been the cliffhanger for India's growth story for a really long time. Only if we had the state capacity. But sadly, we don't really get around to doing this. And it's very difficult to get around to doing it, to be fair to the government. But if now is the time for us to really make sure we push ourselves more towards that reform agenda. Because if not now, then when? But interestingly, I think another very important point to look at is how this has some impact on the risk factors that the economy deals with. Because then we're looking at something which is where there's a concentration of economic powers in the hands of few large corporates, which may be problematic in the future. So what is your take on this, Sarthak?
Yeah, so there can be concentration of economic power, which can lead to anti-competitive practices. So we need to think of that as well. And as a result of which, the consequence of concentration of economic power can be policy capture, where again, some special interests, they would go ahead and shape public policies. And we need to be wary of that.
So this has been a great discussion. And I think we don't really have one particular answer, and it's very difficult to have a right and a wrong answer. But I think the idea is always to do a cost-benefit analysis and see what the trade-offs are. And it'll be interesting to see how things pan out and what all reforms are waiting and how we're going to approach this problem. So thank you for being here, Sarthak. This has been a great conversation and lovely talking to you.
Thanks, Saurabh.
Please consider signing up for Takshashila's courses. Applications are now open and you can apply at www.takshashila.org.in/courses. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's been an absolutely incredible week on the network. We had so many great guests, so many great episodes. Advertising is dead. We had Faye D'Souza on. Varun took a break for 4 weeks, but what a bang he's back with. Siddharth Deshmukh celebrates the 100th episode of The Traveling Professor. It is an amazing show which I cannot say enough good things about. Please do listen to it. And a different Siddharth on the network, Siddharth Bhatia. He's just been absolutely guest after guest, right? This week, Zoya Akhtar talking about Gully Boy. I couldn't imagine a more interesting conversation. Ragini Kumar is on 2 different episodes this week. She is on Cyrus Says and she is on Edges and Sledges, both in anticipation of her new show, Zindagi Diaries. Do check out her appearance on both of those shows and her new show as well. Tanvi and Shloko, the Millennial Athlete, had a phenomenal episode with Dinesh Karthik and Abhishek Nair. Absolutely riveting stuff, talking about mentorship in many different ways. Definitely do give that a listen. And finally, I have a request to all of you. We have our listener survey going out this week. Every year we send out a listener survey at the end of the year. We're doing it again this year. And we would really, really, really appreciate your help in letting us know a little bit more about yourself. Our advertisers are really keen to find out who is listening to us and more about them. Anything that you could do is kept anonymously, and we would really appreciate your help in this. And to sweeten the pot just a little bit, we'll be giving a randomly selected group of participants in the survey some IBM swag. Last year we gave out coffee mugs. What we're going to give out this year is still a surprise. So please do help us out. Would really, really appreciate that. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Have you ever wondered how successful people do their thing? How do they navigate the challenges they often face? Are you wondering about the future of restaurants, film, education, technology, and everything else in between? Hi, I'm Gauri Devidayal, best known for being one of the brains behind The Table, an award-winning restaurant in Bombay. One thing my life as a restaurateur has given me is the opportunity to meet with some truly inspiring people, most often just by chatting with strangers at the community table. And that's what this podcast is about. It's about learning the new dimensions of business and understanding how different people swim this sea. It's an opportunity for me to pick their brains and ask them all the questions on my mind, whether it's about learning from their past experiences or talking about future trends. Through their journeys, stories, and insights, I hope you too, like me, will come away inspired and energized. So come, join me every Wednesday with your favorite drink, because this round is on me.